Now playing in a world where we're not sure if we want to go back to the theaters. You know, I always usually say that if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you're in the seats with once more. But technically today, that's a lie because I'm actually not here right now. I'm on vacation, but that doesn't mean I'm leaving the digital space empty. What we're doing is we're doing something I like to call Critics Corner, where we're sitting down with contemporaries, friends of the site, friends of the show, and we're talking about those movies, those TV shows on various streaming services or even on Blu-ray or disc or what have you that kind of fall through the cracks, that have fallen under the radar, as it were. And I mean, especially during these days where we have so much to watch, it's easier than ever to quite frankly miss stuff. And on this episode, we are talking with a dear friend and someone who pretty much knows as much about this stuff as I do. We are talking with the one and only Mr. Eric Marchen. How you doing today, brother?
Good, Dave. You mentioned Sound of My Voice. We're not talking about the Brit Marling film, but
everything will be a movie reference on this episode. I'm warning you now.
yes, we're all going to just nerd out on this one. That was very nice. That was a very nice introduction. I appreciate it. How have you been? I mean, I know you're on technically,
I am technically not here right now.
Yeah, you're on vacation.
My vacation thoroughly right now, obviously, but just plugging away, man. I mean, the world, as of this airing, will have at least somewhat reopened theatrically for those of us with the itch to get back to going to the movies and seeing that stuff on the big shiny silvery screen. How do you feel about that?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that's the best way to put it. We live in Ontario, and we're about to get back into phase 3, where that means movie theaters, gyms, and a lot of sort of indoor recreation opens that isn't sort of necessarily need to kind of stuff. So like non-essential stuff is now starting to reopen again, and I mean, as much as I want to go, and I am thinking about going maybe the first or second day in the Durham region where I'm from. At the same time, I still want to be cautious with attending a theater that has 25% capacity or so, and still maybe wear a double mask, even though I'm also double vaxxed at this point in the incubation period is finished. So it's exciting in the sense of like, oh, I'd love to see F9 on the big screen or something like that, but it's also like, ease into it, see how things go.
I think that's good advice for anybody out there. And I mean, it's definitely a reminder just if we want to sort of get back to that movie loving that we watch, wear your mask and get your vaccinations done, because it's an important thing. We don't want those variants spreading around and making people sick when it doesn't have to be. So please, do your part and go get vaccinated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's more important than just recommending a film on Critics Corner for this. It's just get vaccinated and make sure that your loved ones are as well, and it's a courtesy as well to your neighbors and the community that you live in.
Well said, man. And you know what? You serve the neighbors in the community that you live in, because people would recognize your dulcet tones from several places out there. Could you? Well, obviously you've been on the show before. Could you just tell everybody listening where they can find you, be it TV, podcast, what have you?
Yeah. So I co-host a podcast with fellow film critic Matt Rohrbeck called the Untitled Movie Podcast. It's a series of podcasts. You can find all of that on untitledmoviepodcast.com. And then on top of that, I host a show on Rogers TV Durham called Cinema Scene. The latest episode actually features Dave and I talking about all things movie related, and sort of it's very topical and sort of a current what's going on in the industry, and sort of just our love of films, and we ramble on for about a half an hour. It's basically like a podcast, but in television form. So you can find that on rogerstv.com/cinema scene, and cinema scene is spelled SEEN. So yeah,
but I better make sure this gets up while that episode's airing.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, as we're recording this is obviously not in real time. If you're listening to this,
because I'm on vacation.
Yes. Dave's episode is actually dropping in about an hour or so as we're recording this. So it's exciting that I'm shooting this with you or recording this with you, and then this other episode on this other show that I do is it's a double dose of Dave, double Vax and double Dave.
Gotta love it. But you know what? That's I think that's a good transition into what we're talking about today, because I mean, you and I have been around this business and been around people in and outside of the business long enough to be like to have heard sort of that proclamation of, I've watched everything on Netflix, I've watched everything on Prime. No,
which is
haven't.
A lie. It's a lie. That's a total lie.
Because we haven't watched everything on Netflix and Prime. It's a complete lie. But there is so much more stuff that's out there, be it on streaming, even theatrical or virtual cinema, or even on disc, which is, I know, near and dear to both Eric and my hearts, because we love the physical media. And I'm just curious, like, is there anything sort of that stands out for you right now that isn't necessarily getting the love that it deserves, be it new or even something older?
Yeah, I mean, there's always something, especially in this day and age where, physical media, we talk about it in the way that it's on its way out, but it also seems like it's never been better, especially when it comes to boutique labels really repping either obscure movies or films that haven't had a proper Blu-ray release. And the film that I picked isn't necessarily an obscure title, and it actually did quite well back in 1983. Film I'm going to be choosing is David Cronenberg's The Dead Zone, which is getting a new Blu-ray collector's edition released through Scream Factory, which they always do a great job. And I was a little bit nervous because it was a couple years ago or a year and a half ago now, that Paramount released like the bare bones version. Yeah. And this was the first time that The Dead Zone was released on Blu-ray through this sort of like 5-film Stephen King set. Yeah. And I was thinking, oh no, is this going to be the only version of The Dead Zone that's available on Blu-ray? Because I had been holding on to my DVD copy for so long, because before that you could only get like an Australian Blu-ray. And I always thought that was a little bit weird. But then also, we're going to jump around a little bit on this as well. I just kind of love that you've had Vestron Video and Lionsgate release a really solid Blu-ray copy of Shivers. Criterion releases Crash in North America, and then Arrow releases a version of it in Europe. And now we're getting The Dead Zone. Again, like, depending on when you're listening to this, it'll be available on July 27th through Scream Factory. This really nice 2-disc edition of The Dead Zone. So it's really nice to see someone who is a Canadian filmmaker who's well regarded, and his work continues to be discussed. Obviously, you can't, if you're talking about body horror, you have to mention David Cronenberg. There's just no way you can't. Like, it's, he's the godfather of sort of that genre of filmmaking within horror, but also sort of the style and sort of looking inwards. It's you have to talk about him when it comes to that stuff. And it's also just interesting that in that very year that The Dead Zone came out, which was, in 1983, October of that year, he also released Videodrome in February. And for my money, I mean, The Dead Zone, I wouldn't say is my favorite David Cronenberg movie. I think it comes down to The Fly or Videodrome, and sometimes I have to flip a coin to pick which one. But I always find that The Dead Zone is one of those movies where it's like, that was kind of the first time that David Cronenberg was kind of, going into a more mainstream sort of arena, making a movie that wasn't based on tax shelter dollars with films like Shivers and Rabid and Scanners. And he's adapting, he's directing a film that's based on an author who at that point, still very prolific, but was also sort of riding this wave of success with Carrie and The Shining, even though he dismisses Stephen King dismisses The Shining and says that that's not really his version of what he believes it to be the best adaptation. He thinks that the Steven Weber one is, and he's wrong. But But with the Dead Zone specifically, I think it's one of those movies that I do believe is one of the best Stephen King adaptations. Obviously, when people talk about Stephen King adaptations, they mention, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. They mention the Frank Darabont movies, whether it be Shawshank or The Green Mile, and then also The Mist, and rightfully so. I mean, all those movies are great, but there's just something that I think with the Dead Zone, maybe it was a little bit of its time in the early 80s, but it's still like, when I think about that movie, I always think about how sad it is in a lot of ways. And it's maybe one of Cronenberg's most vulnerable films as a filmmaker, and that, he treats the Christopher Walken character, Johnny Smith, with maybe more decency and humanity than he would some of his other characters who, he enjoys sort of watching the exploits unfold on screen, where this, his, you look at this guy's life, that's kind of basically sort of, the road is kind of built for him, and he's going down this path that he's gonna, get married and have a family, and has a great teaching career, and then all of a sudden that is all taken away in this horrible accident. And when he wakes up, he's given a gift, but it's also a curse of him being able to, see people's futures, but also know their pasts. And I think that, again, Christopher Walken's one of those great actors. He's almost like the acting equivalent of Bacon, where like you put him in anything and he's always good, even if the film itself is bad. But here, I think this is one of his best performances of his career, because again, it's a very tender and thoughtful performance, but it also is inherently tragic, especially with sort of the third act, but also the stuff with Brooke Adams, and sort of like, Brooke Adams's character, his sort of fiance and partner at one point, and then sort of, her life kind of moving on after, Johnny's been in this coma for so long, and thinking like he was never going to come back. And like, it even reminds me a little bit of like, with Robert Zemeckis' Castaway, where kind of like that third act goes, and it can be very tragic at times in that way, or even the relationship that Walken has with his doctor, which is very poignant and moving. But rewatching it for this, the thing that I was also kind of struck by a little bit more, just knowing sort of like screenplay structure a little bit better than I did when I was 12, it is really episodic. I found this to be like it made sense that they made this into a TV series with Anthony Michael Hall. It feels like there's about 3 or 4 stories, and it's not that it's cohesive, but at the same time, it almost feels like, okay, this could have been expanded into a half an hour episode. And, like the stuff with Tom Skerritt's police chief kind of asking him for help to hunt down this killer, or obviously the stuff with Martin Sheen at the end, or even sort of the detour of Walken's character sort of teaching again and helping the one kid. And obviously the iconic sort of line that's become a joke on social media with, the ice is going to break and things like that, and the delivery of that. But it does have this episodic quality that kind of feels like, okay, it makes sense that out of any of Stephen King's stuff, that this would be perfect for television or like an ongoing, series, because I think the Dead Zone series lasted like 5 or 6 seasons.
Yeah.
And that's maybe where, like, the difference between, like, you look at a lot of Cronenberg stuff, and like, he's a guy that, again, it feels like his sort of interests and vision, while very singular in the majority of his works, this is the one film that came at a time where, and I'm sure you're very much aware of this as well, where he had the nickname, David Depraved Cronenberg, and obviously he had his battles with the ratings boards and things like that with his films, because they were considered lewd and crass and again, sort of violent to the extreme. But his style has now been embraced and looked upon as great art, and sort of transcending a genre of filmmaking that you just can't help but love. Especially, there's this weird Canadian pride that comes with that, where it's like, he's our guy. He's the guy that kind of made genre filmmaking in Canada something internationally known. And again, you have to, when you're talking body horror, you have to talk about David Cronenberg. You just can't not mention him with that. And The Dead Zone is one of those movies where it kind of feels like it doesn't have a lot of Cronenberg's kind of sort of interests in there. Like, it almost feels like he's making one for them instead of one for me. And especially because it is his kind of first big studio film. But then obviously when, he goes from 83 to 86 with The Fly is very much a David Cronenberg movie inside and out. So I think without The Dead Zone, you don't get that version of The Fly. And I almost feel like The Dead Zone was his door to another dimension.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, I 100% agree. And I mean, even when thinking about Walken's career, because I mean, he was at such an interesting time coming off of, stuff like Deer Hunter and sort of the exhausting nature that was Heaven's Gate, to the insanity that was Pennies from Heaven, into stuff like Brainstorm and then Dead Zone. And what did he do right after Dead Zone? He was Max Zorin in A View to a Kill. It almost feels like Dead Zone was a bit of a commercial jumping off point for both men.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also just interesting to look at that. Like, I mean, he goes from, Douglas Trumbull to David Cronenberg. Obviously mentioning, Michael Cimino as well, and sort of having that relationship even before Heaven's Gate with, winning the Oscar for supporting actor with The Deer Hunter and that amazing performance, and sort of, Heaven's Gate being the end of the, relationship between studios and auteur filmmakers, and going with more sort of franchise-based films into the 80s. And The Dead Zone is this weird movie that, again, it's also shot in, St. Catharines, Ontario, and has a lot of Canadian actors in there, Nicholas Campbell and things like that. But it is such a very strange kind of movie in the sense of it has a very bleak, pessimistic style to it. And again, like it's a very sad movie. I think I was really honing in on that, watching it this time around, and thinking to myself, like, this is a hard watch. This is just as hard to watch as any of his sort of more repulsive stuff, or what people perceive to be as more repulsive stuff. Like, and I think that's where the Cronenbergness of his style comes through in this movie, where it is dealing with sort of the decline, not of the human body per se, but the decline of sort of the mental aspects of a human's mind, and just the idea that somebody, is dealing with something and grappling with something that is basically, having to trigger them to do something extreme, or realizing that they have to kind of, interject themselves into a situation because they know what could happen if they don't otherwise. And again, I mean, The Dead Zone has been referenced a lot in the Trump era, and sort of especially with the Martin Sheen character. But I do think it is one of those little movies that has been kind of forgotten in terms of, like, being released when it was. And also, when you think of David Cronenberg's career, that's not necessarily the first film that comes to mind. And I've just been thinking a lot about it more as well, because the exciting thing is Cronenberg is coming back and is making a new movie, Crimes of the Future, shooting it in Greece, and people like Viggo Mortensen are going to be in it, and Leah Seydoux and what have you. And that really, I think, was one of the most exciting pieces of movie news that I've heard in some time, because he's gone through a lot in the last few years. He sadly lost his partner and what have you, and he was basically in semi-retirement. And I was kind of thinking to myself, man, I really don't want Maps to the Stars to be his last film. And so, Neon, distributing this in the US, and even like his son, Brandon Cronenberg, with the success of Possessor last year, and Neon also, buying and distributing his next movie, Infinity Pool. And I believe Elevation Pictures has it here in Canada. It's just fascinating to see, like, the battle of the Cronenbergs in the next couple of years, but just knowing that David Cronenberg is going to come back and do another movie. I've never had the chance to interview him or talk to him.
Me either, yeah.
But if I were, I would blame him for being a hypochondriac, because I've talked about this on the Untitled Movie Podcast. I've talked about this on Rogers TV, but I remember watching David Cronenberg's The Fly at maybe the age of 7 or 8 and being traumatized by it for the rest of my life, and being afraid of every ache and pain and the slow decay of the human body in that film, and thinking, like, when am I slowly gonna fall apart? And like, it's like, and I just remember, especially in high school, I was terrified of disease and death, and like the agonizing slow end of someone. And so I I think that would be the thing I would talk to him about. I'd just be like, so thanks for being responsible for keeping me up at like all hours of the night, worrying if this like sort of like elbow ache is cancer or something like that, and and thinking like, oh, am I going to mutate into something horrible? So yeah, I think he's one of those. He's probably one of the most visceral filmmakers I've ever had the opportunity to watch his films. And again, Videodrome and The Fly, I think are my two favorites of his, in terms of sort of his renaissance. When in the early 2000s, A History of Violence is incredible. It's a lean, mean piece of filmmaking, but I think The Dead Zone is just this fascinating outlier in Cronenberg's career.
No, and I mean, no, I absolutely agree with you. And I mean, it's definitely going to be a disc that's worth picking up, because if memory serves, it's not readily available on any of the streaming services right now, if I'm not.
No, it's not. It is available on, you can purchase it to rent on Amazon Prime. And I believe it was at one point on either Prime or Tubi or something like that, but it just recently was taken down, and maybe partly it's because it is getting this new Blu-ray release. But you can still purchase it to rent, or I think own, through Amazon Prime.
And with the Paramount Plus launch coming pretty soon, I can imagine maybe that had part to play with it as well.
Totally.
Now, I mean, there's so many others that we could talk about, and I mean, there's one that I'd love to get your opinion on, which came out on disc not all that long ago from the Criterion Collection, but it is available on the Criterion channel as well. It's Smooth Talk, Joyce Chopra's Smooth Talk, with
Laura Dern and Treat Williams.
And I mean, I didn't know this movie had existed until I saw it, and then I watched it, and I mean, it is this sleazy but thrilling, really sort of compelling dive into an underbelly that I just didn't know a damned thing about, and I'm curious if you've had a chance to watch that yet.
I haven't watched the Criterion version. I have the Olive Films Blu-ray.
Okay.
And I remember watching it not too long ago. And when I mean not too long ago, probably within the last 10 years. Because time, again, goes by so differently, especially in the last year or so. But I think what I was most surprised by was how the female gaze sort of works so strongly in this film. And I think, again, like Laura Dern in that movie, shows so many facets and sides of her character, of being sort of a teen falling in love, but also at the same time knowing that the Treat Williams character is the predator, but how that's handled by a woman, and thinking like, okay, well, what if this was directed by a man, and like, would it have the same kind of nuance and sort of thought put into it, or would it kind of be more aggressive and almost maybe sort of a sort of 90s erotic thriller, sort of taken in that sort of way? This is more almost like a cautionary tale that has sort of texture and gray zones to it, where like it's just interesting watching that relationship unfold, and you can understand why it's so intoxicating for Laura Dern's character, but at the same time you're still very much aware of what Treat Williams is, and it's blistering and rough around the edges. And it's one of those movies where it's just like, I really wish that more people knew about it, and could check it out. And now, because the Criterion is out, they can. So it's one of those like late 80s films that I almost feel like would be in a weird kind of category with something like River's Edge, even, like something that's a little bit sort of it has people that you're obviously, because Laura Dern was also in Blue Velvet around this time, and that movie obviously has a life of its own, and people know what that is. But yeah, Smooth Talk is just one of those films that it just kind of feels like it's just now starting to sort of build an audience and a cult status.
Yeah.
But every time somebody watches it, they're always blown away by it, which I think is important, because like it is one of those movies where I haven't heard anybody be like, oh, that was a bad movie. It's sometimes difficult to watch because it's a very challenging movie, but it's so powerful and well done, and it has elements of genre filmmaking in there as well. And again, I think Laura Dern is amazing in that movie. So yeah, that is a great under the radar pick that Criterion, when you think of Criterion recently, there's been a lot of sort of bigger titles that they've been going with, whether it be something from the 80s like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, or
Parallax View, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, or just even some of like the Netflix stuff or the Amazon stuff that they're releasing. But then they release something like Smooth Talk, and you're kind of like, this is excellent, because because it's finally a filmmaker's finally getting their due. And then also it's exposing it to more people to have a chance to watch it. And I really do hope that more people do. And it also kind of thinks like your imagination runs wild with like, okay, well, what else could Criterion release like this? Like, are we ever going to get One False Move and Devil in a Blue Dress on Criterion Blu-ray? Because it's been on the channel, and it's never been like Devil in the Blue Dress has been released through Twilight Time, but One False Move has never had a Blu-ray release.
That's correct. Yeah. No, I mean I think Smooth Talk is a good transition into something that actually just came out this year, which is now available on DVD, and it probably will be available on. It probably is available on VOD. I'd have to double check, and it might end up being available on the Film Movement Plus streaming service pretty soon. But it's an Irish film called Rose Plays Julie, which it's basically this story of a young woman who was adopted and has a great relationship with her family, but wants to know about sort of her birth parents and does more research into this. And well, the further she gets into this story, the further we're getting into some very dark territory. And it's such an excellent and really well executed film from writer directors Christine Malloy and Joe Lawler, excuse me. And it stars Orla Brady and Aidan Gillen. And I mean, it is this really sort of insidious but really compelling piece of cinema that like I could not take my eyes off of. It's really a fantastic film.
Yeah, it's an intensely wound piece of filmmaking that sort of unspools as the story goes along, and you're never at ease in the way that sort of that kind of cold contemporary look, whether you watch sort of the lead character in school and sort of learning the trade of being a veterinarian. And I also thought a little bit of Raw when I was watching it as well. The Julia DeCarno movie with some of the shots of like the cows and the horses and things like that. But yeah, it's fascinating to sort of also think like you never see the happy side of this protagonist family. Like she talks to her father on the phone at one point, but other than that, it's basically all cut off. It's all about her trying to find, her birth parents and sort of why she is or where she is in her life and where these other characters are, and sort of her playing a role as mentioned in the title, and sort of trying to explore not only the aspects of where she came from, but, if she were somebody else and if she were this other person and had this other life and where that goes. But it's also very grim, very provocative in its own way. And it's one of those little movies that, you need somebody to recommend it, because I feel like it could easily kind of go by the wayside or fall through the cracks otherwise. But then you watch it and you're just taken aback by sort of the solid filmmaking and the performances and the cinematography specifically. And I mean, the day that it was released on demand or digitally in Canada was the same day that Violation also came out, and it's interesting that both of those
That's
movies,
another great choice. Absolutely.
yeah, they're actually having a conversation about sort of the revenge tale from the female perspective, which I think again is really important to sort of basically strip down and sort of recontextualize that genre from the female point of view, because there's not a lot of, whether they be slasher films or exploitation movies that do the same thing. The only one I can think of off the top of my head that is, that was made in the 80s was Slumber Party Massacre, that
Right.
had a female writer and a female director, where most of those films were sort of very male centric and misogynistic, and we're all about the kills, and now you're getting this sort of look, and I'm not saying that this is a slasher film, but it's dealing with sort of like psychological horror in such an interesting way, that I think that you look at that, and again, Violation more so in terms of looking at like I Spit on Your Grave. Like I look at I Spit on Your Grave, and then I look at Violation, and they're both ugly movies because of what they're dealing with, but Violation has this amazing artistry and it is very conscientious about what it's doing, where I Spit on Your Grave is
just ugly.
Is ugly and sensational for sort of getting people to go to the drive-in theater at in the 1970s or early 80s.
No, I would definitely agree with you on that. It's one of those films that it's definitely polarizing, but it's yeah. The less said about I Spit on Your Grave, the better. Let's move on. But there is something that I got to draw some attention to, because I mean, when most people fire up their Disney Plus, this isn't the kind of movie that they would expect would be on there. It's not the best movie in the world, but I think it's one that kind of demands to be seen. Brian De Palma's The Fury is available on Disney Plus, and I mean, it's the story of a government agent who has his psychic son kidnapped, and then the father has to find another telekinetic teenager to help track his son down. It's Kirk Douglas. It is
John Cassavetes blowing up.
John Cassavetes. It is
Amy Irving
and what's his face? Stevens. Why am I blanking on his name?
Carrie Snodgrass as well, right? Because she came out of retirement to work with Kirk Russell or Kirk Douglas. Pardon me.
That was it. And Carrie Snodgrass, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like it's again, like when you think of sort of the canon of Brian De Palma, you think of like some of the things like Carrie, but then like there is such a wide sort of swath of stuff that he didn't. I really feel like Fury lands sort of uncomfortably in the middle. If it's half a spy thriller and it's half a very over the top sort of psychic horror film that
it predates Scanners too, which is interesting. Right. So, but the thing with okay, I'm gonna be completely honest with you. The Fury is not a great movie in my opinion.
No,
I think that it has a lot of pacing issues. I mean, you talked about sort of being part spy thriller and part X-Men movie, or looking at like even Firestarter as well. Like it kind of feels like they were probably, you mentioned Carrie, obviously being kind of the Fury being the follow-up to that for De Palma. I think to myself, there's one like iconic scene in that film, and that is the referencing of John Cassavetes blowing up at the end. And I mean, if you need somebody in the 1960s to early 80s to play a complete and utter scumbag, you get John Cassavetes.
Oh yeah, I mean,
he is like, you don't need to do anything else. Like he just comes to set, he crawls out of a sewer and he's perfect.
But I mean, that's the amazing thing to watch with John Cassavetes, because I mean, obviously, like there is this amazing filmmaking track record, but you see him play these dirtbags whenever he acts, and it's kind of a marvel to watch. Like I almost put this film as an interesting cinematic oddity, if that makes any kind of sense.
Totally. And again, like I can't recommend the movie, but I get what you're saying, where it's like it's just this strange sort of outlier in Brian De Palma's career, where like he had this massive success with Carrie, and I almost feel like he was looking at this as almost like, okay, well, I'm doing some things that are similar, but at the same time, I'm going to spice it up a little bit with sort of the espionage aspect of it, and I've got this huge movie star with Kirk Douglas, and you think like, okay, this is going to be another huge hit for him, and obviously, Brian De Palma is one of those guys that kind of had a hit he's very much like Wes Craven. He had a hit kind of every decade from the 70s, 80s into the 90s. So with Brian De Palma, Carrie, The Untouchables, and Mission Impossible are all these kind of like monumental achievements for him within the studio system, in the same way that, Wes Craven had a success with Last House on the Left, Nightmare on Elm Street, and then Scream, where De Palma has always been one of those hit or miss guys. But when he's on, he's on. But this is more of like what you said. It's a curiosity. It's almost like it's in the same way that like people go and watch Michael Mann's The Keep, or are interested in Michael Mann's The Keep, because it's like, when you think of Michael Mann, you think of slick crime thrillers with sort of fatalistic qualities or nihilistic qualities that have an amazing soundtrack. You don't think of like a golem-esque creature in a World War II castle setting. Like it's such, and also because Michael Mann doesn't want people to see it, so it makes it almost like taboo in its own way, right? But yeah, the Fury's definitely one of those interesting ones where it's like, again, like if you're a Brian De Palma fan or completist, I would definitely recommend it on that regard. But in terms of like Disney Plus stuff, I mean, there's a lot of really wonderful movies like, The Savages and Danny Boyle's Sunshine that I would recommend over the Fury first.
Well, of course. Yeah. No. I think my general point was just to remind maybe audiences out there that there is more than just the animated or the kid fare over there on Disney Plus. There's actually, they've dived into some of the deep catalog stuff pretty efficiently well.
Yeah, and it also kind of makes you appreciate, like, again, it's a very slow movie, or I shouldn't say slow, it's of its time. The pacing of it is of its time. But when you watch a movie like that or rewatch a movie like that, you also are kind of humbled by the experience and realize, okay, well, sometimes you have to kind of dig through the dirt to get to that sort of, that truffle, that special moment in the movie. And obviously the moment in that film comes very late, but it almost makes it worth it. And I feel like there's a lot of movies that are like that, where we think about them fondly and wear rose tinted glasses because we remember watching them as kids, and they had a greater effect on us then because of those minimalist moments. But then when you go back to them, it's like, man, this takes forever to get to the scene that you want to, because we live in a time where it's all instant gratification, and we've become sort of acclimatized to, filmmaking that is studio based anyways, and North American based, that is sort of fast paced and needs to get to A to B as quickly as possible, even if it's convoluted. International cinema obviously moves to its own beat, but you look at filmmaking in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s, there are films where you love certain moments in them, but maybe the film themselves, it doesn't hold up, or you think to yourself, okay, well, like, why did I like this movie the first time around? And it's like a specific scene, but to get to that scene, there's so much more around it in order to do that. And that's what I think of like with the Fury, where the Fury has this great practical effect that you're just kind of like, wow, that really made watching this thing worthwhile. But then, you go back to it and you're kind of like, oh man, it just takes forever to get there.
Now, I mean, is there anything else you can think of that is sort of maybe more current stuff that maybe has sort of flown under the radar for a few people?
Well, I mean, there's tons of stuff, and I think that again, like it's always kind of like a rabbit hole situation where it's like, okay, for example, Black Widow, talking about Disney Plus and being a premium VOD on Disney Plus. A lot of people have been discovering Florence Pugh in the last few years with obviously now Black Widow, but Midsommar and Greta Gerwig's version of Little Women. But
Lady Macbeth.
Lady Macbeth is the film that I remember seeing at TIFF in their platform section and thinking to myself, this person is a star. This is an incredible performance of somebody that's put into a situation, into sort of a cast situation, and basically thrives. And we root for this character, even though she does some reprehensible things to stay alive and get to the top of this patriarchy. It's an incredible movie, but on top of that, it's just so beautifully made. The sound design, specifically in this sort of Victorian era home, and also the gallows humor. And you think to yourself, William Oldroy hasn't directed anything else since then, feature wise, but he has such a deft hand at creating a space for this character to inhabit and eventually completely reign over. And Pugh is just a force of nature to be reckoned with in that film. Yeah, and it's just one of those movies where it's like, if you saw it at TIFF or saw it when it was being released theatrically, and you talk to people now that are discovering her through those other movies, it's kind of like, well, I was there first, like I saw this movie and I was blown away by her then. So yeah, it's Lady Macbeth is one of those films. I have the Blu-ray of it, but I think it's one of those MOV titles that like is a burnt disc that Lionsgate released like a couple of years after the fact.
Right.
But it is a just a great performance piece, but also just it's the kind of period piece I love because it has bite to it. It has an edge.
No, and I have a sneaking suspicion it's also like if you're a subscriber of either maybe the Super Channel or Hollywood Suite, I think it might be playing on there right now.
Yeah.
So that's a good way to watch it that way. But no, you're absolutely right. It is one of those films that I remember seeing it as well. I saw it after TIFF. I saw it after you, but it caught me completely off guard. And I mean, just you knew the second you walked out of that, theater, is like she's going to be a somebody. And obviously, Florence Pugh has become a somebody in a very big way.
Yeah, it's like I also like again going back to I think it was platform at TIFF as well, and recently having that same feeling with Jessie Buckley in Beast, where like coming from a sort of singing point of view, like she comes from like a sort of song and dance theater background. And watching Beast is not as good of a movie compared to Lady Macbeth is a great film. Beast is okay. But that performance in Beast from Jessie Buckley, there's a church scene specifically outside the church. It is so guttural. And that moment I was thinking to myself, who is this? Like, this person is amazing. And then, she is incredible in Charlie Kaufman's I'm Thinking of Ending Things. And then you read this interview with Charlie Kaufman saying, okay, well, the original actor we had, who was Brie Larson, couldn't be in the film anymore because she had obligations with Disney for the Captain Marvel Avengers Endgame press junket stuff. And one of the crew recommended watching Beast. And it's become a calling card, and it's the same thing with Lady Macbeth. And again, Beast is kind of a generic sort of small town, or in this case, Isle thriller. But that performance is so honed in, and you're very empathetic towards her, even when you learn sort of her backstory. And watching that movie again, I was thinking to myself, like, man, this, like, I didn't really watch Taboo with Tom Hardy, which he's also in, or the miniseries version of War and Peace, the more recent one, which he's also in. But then watching this, or Beast, and then watching I'm Thinking of Ending Things, I was thinking to myself, like, she just needs like that one like Marvel movie or something to be in, and then like more people will be like, who is this? And then they can go back and see that film as well, and what have you. She was just cast actually in, or they just finished shooting the Alex Garland movie, the new Alex Garland film Men.
That's right, yeah.
Which is a smaller movie, and it's supposed to be extremely weird, which I'm very excited about, because I've loved everything that Alex Garland has done from a writing standpoint and a directing standpoint thus far. So again, like Beast, not a great movie, but in thinking of like great performances within like a solid little film, that's another one that I can definitely think of more recently. But there's always something. I mean, like Criterion just released Bringing Up Baby on Blu-ray for the
Yeah,
first time, and it's just kind of like, that's amazing. Or Deep Cover. I mean, Deep
yeah.
Cover, the Bill Duke movie with Lawrence Fishburne and Jeff Goldblum, which is like this like sort of late era or ode to blaxploitation cinema, but it is also sort of predates Eternal Affairs and The Departed, and is one of those movies that I was dying for on Blu-ray. Like I was thinking, okay, like when is Warner Archive going to release this thing? And then Criterion releases it, and
Right.
to my mind, it is one of the most entertaining action thrillers of the early 90s that I wish more people would see, because it's Lawrence Fishburne in his coolest role.
Oh,
And like
totally.
he's riding the high off of, I mean, he's still going by Larry at this point. He's riding the high off of, Boys in the Hood, and sort of in that stage of being
King
like
of New
one of
York.
the best. Yeah, King of New York, being one of the best dads in Boys in the Hood, and now being one of the coolest sort of leading men in Deep Cover. Like that is a movie that just, it hits. Like it is like, and Jeff Goldblum has the best line delivery of motherfucker ever. So yeah, Deep Cover, definitely another movie that I would highly recommend.
And I mean, just to dial it back a little bit, because I just checked, Lady Macbeth actually is on Prime.
Excellent.
So if you want to check it out, do that. And I know you weren't a big fan, but I loved Jessie Buckley in Wild Rose, which is definitely a little more conventional, but it
Yeah.
definitely showed off her star power. And she's got key roles and stuff like Judy in The Courier, but also she had a key part in Chernobyl, which you can check out on Crave, and she was in the third season of Fargo as well. She's really carving out a career for herself, sort of blending into some very memorable stuff and doing great work.
Yeah, great character work. And I didn't dislike Wild Rose. I agree with you what you said. It's very formulaic for the kind of Stars Born style, um, you know, subgenre of movies. And
It's a
we were
bit more
getting
by the numbers, yeah.
yeah, and we were getting a deluge of those at that point as well. But I do agree with you that her performance in that movie is again incredible, and like it sells the whole film. Like like that's the reason why you watch that movie.
Oh, totally.
But yeah, it's I got to go back to Deep Cover again, because Bill Duke right now, like, well, thinking of him working with Steven Soderbergh on both No Sudden Move and High Flying Bird, like I love Bill Duke so much as an actor. Like the first time I remember seeing him in movies were Schwarzenegger films with both Commando and Predator, and being like, this guy is so unique and has such an interesting presence. And then learning about Deep Cover and The Killing Floor, and he's such an underrated
Oh,
filmmaker and has
and
such a
has
unique,
Personal Problems, amazing films.
yeah. And so Bill Duke, man, you can't go wrong with that
Respect for
guy.
Bill Duke for sure.
Yeah.
Well, you know what, man? I know you and I could do this for hours on end, but I think we'll call it a day on that. But thank you again for coming on and taking the time just to find that stuff that has flown under the radar. Because, like I always say, as you always say, for all those people who do think they've broken their streaming services, you're wrong. You're just wrong.
Hey, man, anytime I can recommend The Dead Zone and Deep Cover, it's a good day.
Amen to that, brother. Thanks for the time, buddy. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And don't forget to visit our friends over at Bay Street Video for all your DVD, Blu-ray rental, or purchasing needs this summer, as they are still open for curbside and some mailing delivery as well. Over at 1172 Bay Street, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, you can give them a call at 416-964-9088. That's 416-964-9088. Or send them an email at baystreetvideoto@gmail.com for any of your DVD and Blu-ray needs.